Week 3 is officially upon us where the Minnesota Vikings take host to the Houston Texans, in which, well, is going to be quite the revenge week for not only us and not only the Houston Texans, but a couple stars on each of the teams. Obviously, it's not only because of Danielle Hunter. We have some of the Texans players from last year on our team this season. So let's get right into it. Revenge week against the Houston Texans. Now, on the Texans side of things, Danielle Hunter will be making his return to US Bank Stadium after spending the first 9 seasons of his career with the Vikings. Also, Stephon Diggs will also be on the road sideline in Minneapolis for the first time, although he's pretty far removed from his Vikings tenure, having spent the last 4 years with the Buffalo Bills, but it's still his first trip back to Minneapolis, which obviously means it could be a revenge week for him, even though it is in the past. It doesn't stop there, though. Okay, Cam Akers, who was in Minnesota last season, might be starting at running back for Houston on Sunday, depending on Joe Mixon's health. Also, Cam Akers was apparently on the transaction list for the Minnesota Vikings earlier this offseason, if you don't remember that. We got bamboozled. He ends up signing with Houston. Now he could be their starter for this week's matchup, again, pending Joe Mixon's health. Now, Chris Boyd will play on special teams for the Houston Texans. Former Vikings quarterback Case Keenum is technically with the Texans, though he's on injured reserve. So there's a lot of players or ex-Vikings players that are on this Houston Texans roster. But then on the Vikings side, they added 3 players this offseason who were on the 2023 Texans. Jonathan Grenard, who was the replacement for Danielle Hunter, basically just flip-flopped those two, and Blake Cashman. Okay, both had breakout years in Houston, are now off to great starts in Minnesota. Blake Cashman is a Minnesota native. I believe he's from Eden Prairie, if I'm not mistaken. Played for the Minnesota Golden Gophers in college. Then he gets drafted, I believe, by the Jets. He bounced around, found his way to Houston, and now he's back home back in his home state with the Minnesota Vikings. Now, with Grenard essentially stepping in as Hunter's replacement, we already went through that. Shaq Griffin, one of the Vikings' top 3 cornerbacks, played in 10 games for the Houston Texans last year before getting cut, which should say something. That is definitely going to be a revenge game, or this will be for Shaq Griffin, because he did get cut by the team, which basically the team told him, you're not good enough to play for us. But that also could mean that a lot of people got back from injury. They didn't need him. They saw that, hey, let's give him a chance somewhere else. Let's just release him and kind of go from there. Save a little bit of money. Now, here's what Kevin O'Connell had to say about this situation. He said, these are good football players that you're talking about at both spots. Both organizations are aware of the impact those guys can have on the game. What I think is the coolest part is just seeing the growth, the fit in the new destination. Danielle Hunter, Chris Boyd, some of those players that are thriving under DeMeco Ryans and the Houston Texans. And then I'd like to think that JG, Jonathan Grenard, Blake Cashman, and Shaq Griffin are doing the same thing here. Now, Hunter and Diggs were members of the Vikings 2015 draft class, along with Eric Kendricks, who developed into stars in Minnesota. Now, Diggs, of course, was on the receiving end of the Minneapolis Miracle. Still gives me goosebumps to this day. Absolutely loved that memory, which remains one of the greatest moments in franchise history and arguably one of the greatest moments in NFL history. Now, Hunter made 4 Pro Bowls and recorded 87.5 sacks in a Vikings uniform, putting him in position to join the organization's Ring of Honor someday, which I'd assume would be the case. He had back-to-back 14.5 sack seasons. Last year, had 16.5. The dude was an absolute freak of nature here, but who knows? Only time will tell if he'll get added to that Ring of Honor for the Minnesota Vikings. Now, last offseason, Danielle Hunter was involved in some contract drama, and not for the first time, right? Before agreeing to a 1-year restructured deal that set him up to hit free agency this spring. He went out and had a career-high 16.5 sacks under Brian Flores, earning a 2-year, $49 million deal from the Houston Texans. Now, Hunter, who grew up in the Houston area, now gets to play for a contender in his home city. So it all worked out quite nicely, right? Remember, we signed Danielle Hunter just a year ago or 2 years at this point. Kind of restructured his deal because he was only going to make a base salary of like $4 million. Let's give this guy a little bit more money for 1 season. Let him test out free agency, see if we can bring him back, pending the Justin Jefferson contract, what's going to happen with Kirk Cousins. All those things kind of played a factor in Danielle Hunter ultimately leaving after we couldn't find a contract for him and going to the Houston Texans, which good for him. He's back in his home state, just like we got Blake Cashman back in his home state. Now, Kevin O'Connell also, I do believe, went on and said, From year one to year two is where Danielle and our relationship grew. The early part of training camp, that whole contract situation, spent a lot of time with him daily, leading into him feeling good about last year. And as him and I had envisioned together, him and I going out there and just being lights out and having the opportunity to go find if it wasn't going to be here. Now, I wanted him to find a great place to go play and continue what he did in 2023. I think he found a great home, literally in his hometown, which I think is all pretty sweet. Every kid's dream, I feel like, is to play for their hometown, team, unless your team is elsewhere, okay, and you're from one state, your team is in another state. You get it, all right? It's just your favorite team. That's who you want to play for. Now, the Vikings are quite happy with Jonathan Grenard, who came over from the Houston Texans and has recorded 12 pressures in first two games of the season, but they're also well aware of how dangerous Danielle Hunter can be. I think us as fans also know that as well. He can be a game wrecker, right? He was dominating Houston's week 2 win over the Bears, recording 7 pressures and 1.5 sacks. Now, Chicago has an awful offensive line, so who knows how much of that was the offensive line's fault and how much it was actually Danielle Hunter, but he's still a really good player, still a game wrecker. We have to watch out for him, right? Now, reigning defensive rookie of the year, Will Anderson matched that same stat line in a game where the Texans were, like I said, we're all over Chicago rookie quarterback Caleb Williams. That offensive line in Chicago, they got to figure it out. Okay, it's going to be tough. But Kevin O'Connell had this to say on Danielle Hunter: it's the same guy that's just an absolute game wrecker, disruptor, playing really hard, physical. How they play really fits Danielle's skill set and how he can impact the game. And then I think he's going to be an unbelievable mentor in that room to a really talented football player on the other side in Will Anderson. Danielle's has to be a major focal point in our game plan, which obviously is going to be the case, right? Our offense, it can be good. It really can. The offensive line is going to be one of those areas that we continue to look at. How do they progress week to week? So far, week 1, week 2, we've looked really, really good, stopping the likes of Nick Bosa from the San Francisco 49ers, picking up those blitzes from them as well. I'm not really counting the Giants, even though we did stop Dexter Lawrence from time to time, but when he was on the field, he still gave us some fits every once in a while. Kayvon Thibodeau also did some pretty good work. Brian Burns did a decent amount of work as well. But basically, those guys were kind of taken out of the picture during each game, right? The Giants game, the Niners game, our offensive line played really well, and that's because we have one of the top pairs of tackles in the National Football League in Kristen Darisaw and Brian O'Neill. So if they can continue this trend of playing lights out football and protecting Sam Darnold, I think we should have a pretty decent day in stopping Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson Jr. It's not going to be a small task. It's going to be a tough one. It's going to be hard. But this is football, man. This is the NFL. This is revenge week, and I'm all pumped up for it. I want to hear your guys' thoughts about this. What are you more excited about? Danielle Hunter's return, Diggs' return. What do you want the Vikings to do? And who do you think wins this game? I got Minnesota. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Drop a like and subscribe to the channel. It'd be much, much appreciated. Have a great rest of the night, folks. And Skull Vikes.